Okay, for Read Aloud today, we have two chunks of the book left. So if you're on today's chunk, it's the next to last one. And then tomorrow will be the last section of Peter, and you will have officially completed Peter and the Sword of Mercy. So if you remember, Peter was trying to make his way back to the island while things were at kind of a tense point with fighting Prawn and Nezerra inside the cave, with, of course, Mr. Grin lurking about. So we're going to kind of get that resolved before the end of the book. So we're with Peter in chapter 78, which is called Safe Passage. Aboard the Jolly Roger, there was mutiny in the air. The collision with the steamer had left the ship barely a floating wreck. Her masts and spars were smashed, her sails in tatters, and her hull was a sieve of leaks. They had made what repairs they could and jury-rigged a sad pink sail, but she was hardly seaworthy, hardly capable of making 1 or 2 knots at best. And the men had to work constantly at the pumps, 24 hours a day after day, exhausting, trying to keep her from sinking. The food was gone and the water barrel was down to the last few putrid inches. The sun was blistering hot. Every man on board had one goal: to get back to Mollusk Island. That was their only hope, and that was what kept them going. And now they had come to a horrible realization. Captain Hook was lost. He would not admit it, of course. He was Captain Hook, and Captain Hook did not make mistakes, especially sailing ones. But the signs were unmistakable to everyone except the blindly loyal Smee. The ship had been going in circles, big, slow circles. Clearly, Hook had no idea where the island was, and the question now was, what do they do about it? The sailors who were not at the pump or on lookout duty had gathered on the foredeck to discuss this matter. Hook, with Smee at his side, was at the helm, sitting slumped on a crate. Theoretically, he was steering, but as often was the case of late, he didn't even appear to be particularly concerned about what his course was. The crew members had decided that something needed to be done, and were now discussing what it would be. They were evenly divided. Half wanted to throw Hook over the side of the boat. The other half wanted to slit his throat first, then throw him over the side of the boat. Either way, he was a goner. The lone remaining question was who would become the new captain. This was a trickier issue, for Hook, despite his many flaws, was by far the most skilled sailor, and if he was lost, the rest of them would be even more lost. The crew was debating its next course of action when a hoarse cry came from one of the lookouts. "It's him! The flying boy!" Hook was off his crate in an instant, whirling around, scanning the sky. "Where?" he shouted, and then he saw Peter, a few hundred yards offshore, flying towards the ship, erratically and low in the water, clearly in trouble. "Smee," said Hook. "Yes, Captain." "Fetch me pistol." "Yes, Captain." Smee disappeared below, returning moments later with the pistol, which he handed off to Hook. Peter was now almost to the ship. Catching sight of Hook, he reacted with obvious surprise, and then it was about to veer away. But he had no strength left, and with a last desperate lunge, he swerved upward, landing precariously in the rigging above the ship's lone fluttering sail. He looked down at Hook, who looked back up at him. "Hello, boy," said Hook, slowly, dramatically, as he raised the pistol and pointed it at Peter. "Goodbye, boy." He pulled the trigger. Click. Hook stared at the pistol in disbelief. "Smee!" he bellowed. "Yes, Captain." "There are no bullets in this pistol." No, Captain, we don't have any on board." "Then why did you hand me the pistol, Smee? What did you think I was going to do with it?" Smee frowned and thought about it for a moment. Finally, he came to the conclusion. "I don't know." Hook threw the pistol to the deck, turned toward the sailors on the foredeck who were watching these proceedings with interest. "You and you, climb up there and bring me that boy." The two men looked at each other. "No," said one, a big man named Crankins. "No, I am your captain and I gave you an order." Crankins glared defiantly back at Hook. "You ain't the captain no more." "What?" "I said you ain't the captain." "Says who?" "Says all of us," the other sailors nodded in agreement, gathering behind their new spokesman. Hook could always tell when the wind was shifting, and suddenly he switched to a more reasonable tone. "Listen, man, I know things haven't gone well for us lately, but all that will change soon once we reach the island." "You don't know where the island is," shouted a sailor. "You're lost," the others shouted. "Lost? Of course I'm not lost." "And which way is the island?" said Crankins. "Why, it's that way, south by southwest." "That's what you say now, but yesterday you were steering northeast." But, the men were advancing closer. He saw by the look in their eyes they were done talking. "Wait," called a voice from the rigging. The sailor stopped and looked up at Peter. "What?" said Crankins. "I know where the island is. Actually, she does." He pointed to Tinker Bell sitting in his hair. "Which way?" shouted a sailor. "We'll lead you there," said Peter. Tinker Bell chimed something in his ear. "We'll have you there in a day if you give us safe passage." The men spoke amongst themselves for a moment, then Crankins looked up at Peter. "All right, safe passage." Now, all that means is that they're not allowed to harm Peter as he's guiding them back to the island. It's a risky move for Peter, but he really doesn't have any other options, so he's going to go with it. "We're going to make it," he whispered to Tink. "Not if he can help it," said Tinker Bell, pointing down. Peter looked at Hook. The pirate captain was glaring back up at him, his dark eyes glittering with hate. And that's the end of the chapter. Chapter 79 is called The Smile, and we're back on land. The plan was simple. Very dangerous, but simple. Bold Abalone and Fleet Snail, okay, think about what you know about a snail. If you look up the word fleet, you will find that it is the opposite of what you think of a snail, which is typical for Mollusk Island names. You know, they always have those opposite names: fierce clam, fighting prawn, etc. Fleet Snail was the fastest warrior on the island, so it was a logical choice. Bold Abalone was not nearly as fast, but the chief's son, he insisted on being the other two. To make themselves irresistible to Mr. Grin, they went into the jungle and smeared their bodies with boar dung. When they were ready, they circled around so that they were downwind from the cave to prevent the crocodile from picking up their scent too soon. From his perch in the tree, Fighting Prawn watched as his son and Fleet Snail crept toward the clearing. When Bold Abalone signaled they were ready, Fighting Prawn called out, "Nezerra!" "What is it?" came a harsh voice from inside the cave. "Look outside and you will see." "I'd better see a croc leaving, because I'm not going to wait much longer." Cautiously, Nezerra poked his wooden beak outside the cave mouth, and in front of him, Mr. Grin stirred. "He's still there." "Wait," said Fighting Prawn, and he nodded to Bold Abalone and Fleet Snail. With high-pitched cries, the two warriors burst from the jungle and ran across the edge of the clearing, putting themselves upwind. Mr. Grin raised his huge snout in the air, and a second later, displaying amazing agility, he spun around and shot towards the spot where the warriors had just disappeared into the jungle. He plunged in right behind them, his massive body bowling over several trees. Fighting Prawn worried that Bold Abalone and Fleet Snail had not gotten enough of a head start. The plan was to lead Mr. Grin away from the mountain trail towards the steep slope that led down the pirate lagoon. For several minutes, Fighting Prawn could follow their progress by the swaying of the trees as the croc brushed against them. From time to time, Mr. Grin roared, but so far there had been no screams. As the snaking line of swaying trees disappeared down the mountainside, Fighting Prawn prayed that his two brave warriors would be quick enough to avoid the jaws of the beast pursuing them. For now, that was all they could do. It was time to concentrate on saving his daughter. He quickly climbed down from the tree and approached the cave mouth. "Nezerra, I'm here. It's gone." "It had better be, because if it comes back, I'll feed your daughter to it." "It's not coming back." A moment later, Nezerra appeared in the cave mouth, and as before, he had Shining Pearl by the hair and a knife to her neck. He looked at Fighting Prawn, then at the other mollusk warriors who had descended from their trees and now were surrounded in the clearing. "Tell your men not to come any closer." "They will not," said Fighting Prawn. "Good. Now before we leave, my men are going to build a fire to signal the ship. They will need to gather wood. Tell your men to let them." Fighting Prawn grunted a command, and 4 men emerged from the cave. They returned in a few minutes with wood, some of it green. The wood was wet from the storm, so it took a while, but Nezerra grew increasingly impatient to get a fire started. But eventually they did, and it was blazing, tossing the green wood on the flames, sending a billowing stream of black smoke high into the sky. "All right, let's go." Cheeky O'Neill emerged from the cave with the rest of the men. 2 of them were holding the chest, which was full of star stuff, and it was essentially weighing nothing. The men were holding it down as much as carrying it. Fighting Prawn stared at it, wondering if he could really allow these men to take away the source of so much of the island's happiness. But his eyes went back to Shining Pearl, and his heart sank. They started down the mountain trail, O'Neill in front, the two men with the chests next, then Nezerra and Shining Pearl with the rest of Nezerra's men behind them. Ahead of them, behind them, and all around them were Mollusk warriors moving silently through the jungle. Fighting Prawn stayed close to Nezerra, his eyes always on Shining Pearl. The trail was still wet and muddy, and so it was slow going. It took several hours to reach the beach, and when they did, the Nimbus, having seen the signal, moved around the village side of the island and was waiting for them, just outside the reef. Nezerra's men uncovered their launch and dragged it onto the beach and down to the surf. They loaded the chest aboard. The mollusks watched helplessly and gathered in a semicircle around the launch. When Nezerra's men started to board the launch, Fighting Prawn stepped forward. "Now let my daughter go," he said to Nezerra. Nezerra shook his head. "Not here. Leave her here and we will not try to stop you from taking the star stuff. You have my word. And you have my word that when I am aboard the ship with the trunk, I'll send your daughter back on the launch." Fighting Prawn's mind raced. If he had a canoe, he might be able to bargain with Nezerra. 2 warriors in the canoe could accompany the launch and bring Shining Pearl back. But he had no canoe on this side of the island. The mollusks had all come on foot. With a quick, easy motion, Nezerra lifted Shining Pearl into the launch and climbed in after her. "We're pushing off. Don't try to stop us." Fighting Prawn looked at the warriors around him, poised to attack if he gave the word. He looked at his daughter, crying softly in the launch, the blade at her throat. Then he looked into Nezerra's cold, hard eyes, the eyes of a man who was capable of any cruelty. He stepped away from the launch. "Send her back," he said to Nezerra, "or I will track you down." For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes. Then Nezerra turned to his men and barked, "Shove off!" Fighting Prawn turned and grunted some commands of his own. 3 warriors took off running down the beach. They would go back to the village with orders to launch the war canoes immediately. But as he was watching his men sprinting away, Fighting Prawn knew that no matter how fast they ran, the canoes would probably not get to this side of the island in time to do him any good. He turned back to watch the launch, now past the breakers, heading towards the ship. Nezerra was at the tiller with Shining Pearl beside him, looking back at Fighting Prawn. He was smiling. Fighting Prawn did not like the look of that smile. And now we jump onto the boat with Nezerra. From the bow of the launch, Cheeky O'Neill watched the island recede. His eyes lingered on the tall figure of Fighting Prawn standing rigidly on the beach, staring at the men taking his daughter away. "I can't believe he let us go," he said. "He had no choice," said Nezerra, also watching the beach. "I suppose not," said O'Neill. "Do you think are you really planning to send her back?" Nezerra turned to look at O'Neill. "Don't be stupid," he said. And that's the end of the chapter. We have one more to go for the day, but it's a short one. The Jolly Roger was making good speed, considering her battered condition. Since the joyful moment when the island had been sighted, the crew had been busy rigging every possible square inch of pink sail. The men were giddy at the prospect of food, fresh food, and the pure, sweet island water. Even Hook was in a decent mood. With the improvement in the ship's fortunes, the crew had forgotten the recent unpleasantness, and he was captain again. It was Tinkerbell. She was in the rigging, and she was still with the weak Peter, who had spotted the island. And as they drew close, it was Tinkerbell who now spotted the steamship. She pointed it out to Peter, who pointed it out to the lookout, who pointed it out to Hook, who ordered Smee to fetch a spyglass. And that had been 2 hours ago, and now as they drew close, Hook was still studying the ship, trying to make sense of what was going on. "It's going back and forth outside the reef. What do you suppose that is?" One thing I never understood," said Smee, "is why it's back and forth, not forth and back. Seems to me that it would go forth first, and then it would go back." "Smee!" "Yes, Captain?"
"Shut up."
"Yes, Captain." "There's another boat," called Peter.
"What is he talking about?"
said Hook.
"He's right," said the lookout. "There's a launch coming through the reef, making for the steamer."
In a flash, Hook's eye had the spyglass to his eye. He found the launch, and it was being buffeted by the surf around the reef, so it took him a few seconds. But then he saw it between the bodies of the 2 men rowing. A chest. A chest with gold fittings. Hook knew instantly what was in that chest. He had been aboard the flying ship that had brought it to the island in the first place, and he knew it took a special chest to hold it. It was a treasure more valuable than all of the gold on Earth. And Captain Hook, Pirate Captain Hook, meant
to have it. With fire in his eyes, he grabbed the wheel and began shouting orders. Now we go to Peter and Tinkerbell. Peter and Tinkerbell also knew it was in the trunk. They knew they had to get it away from the men taking it off the island. They also knew they had to keep it from falling into the hands of Captain Hook. Peter had not recovered from his long flight over the sea, and he wasn't sure if he could fly, even at all. If he could, he and Tinkerbell talked about briefly how they would do it in the rigging. Then, unseen by the busy pirates below, Tinkerbell took off and began streaking towards the island. And that's the end of our reading for today. So tomorrow will be the last section of the story where hopefully we will get all of your questions answered. And if not, of course, you can kind of ask me once we're done the reading, and we will even set up a little discussion, which I'll tell you a little bit more about tomorrow. So one last chunk of the story to go.